Good morning, everybody, and first of all, thank you to the organizers for inviting me up here to Iceland. It's always a pleasure to be in Reykjavik, despite the bad weather, I suggest. But what I wanted to, this is the one, yes. So what I wanted to do today is to take a slightly different cut on what you have heard this morning from Dr. Ambika. Dr. Ambika and I, we have worked together recently in Korea on aquaculture, and it is absolutely correct that what is happening in Asia is a really, really interesting case. A lot of things are going on. Lots of the things are not exactly what I call green growth, and I think you have confirmed that, and this is a concern. And the cut that I'm going to take today is to look into a bit about what green growth is about for fisheries and for aquaculture, and in that context to discuss a bit about the role of innovation and sustainable management. The first thing, and we have heard this before, is to just give you a little bit of context. And before we do that, I would also want to give a little bit of history in the next slide, but just a little bit of context first. We have heard about growing populations, but what is the really important part of it is not so much that we are going to get 2 billion people more, but we are going to get a lot of income growth. And all that income growth is going to be not particularly nicely distributed across this world. We're going to have it, in particular in Asia, is going to see a phenomenal income growth over the next couple of decades. And we all know that when people, they get higher incomes, they want to have more fish in their diets. And that is the trigger. It is not just the fact that we have increasing populations, it is the income growth that really is an important thing. Climate change considerations have already been looked at. You saw some of the most magnificent photos that I've ever seen on aquaculture installations, and you ask yourselves, do we really want to have copied that situation to Iceland, Norway, Denmark for that matter, where I'm coming from, or other places in the Nordic area? Possibly not. Because what you're seeing here is that there is an enormous pressure on the natural resources, and in particular on the oceans. And that's something I'll come back to at the end of my presentations, because I think that this is the direction we are moving into when we look at fisheries and aquaculture through the green growth prism. Ultimately, what we are looking at and what we need to manage is not fisheries and aquaculture, it is our total take and total use of oceans, and this is something that I'll come back to. Another element was the financial crisis of 2008. We're still suffering from it. You suffer it. This building here was one of the, I think, real sufferers from this event in 2008. And it is only by now, I understand, that you have actually been able to open it, finding the last bits of billions of kroners that needed to go into it. But outside Iceland, we're still feeling the pinch from the financial crisis. And because of that, what we needed after the financial crisis in 2008 was a new growth model. And this was where the whole idea about green growth was coined and came out of the OECD. I wanted to give you just a slightly bit of history, because oftentimes when we look at these things, we see ourselves as being working in a vacuum where nothing else happens. And this is so untrue in the world we are living in. The previous speaker has alluded to it, but there's a couple of things that I would like to, in particular, highlight. First of all, we had the 200-mile extension in '77. That's many years ago, but it created complete havoc in the worlds of fisheries. Iceland was one of those countries that really, I suspect, gained from it. Previously, you had cut wars with the United Kingdom, and there were all sorts of other things that happened that completely upset the whole world of fisheries. This was codified in '82 in the UNCLOS. We had the CFP first one in 1983. We had reforms in New Zealand introducing ITQs, then came Iceland in 1990 or thereabout. We have had reforms in Denmark, Australia, United States and Norway in the 2000s, with a move to go in the direction of using market-based economic instruments for managing capture fisheries. We will have possibly a reform in France, which is quite an interesting thing. And we now have a CFP4 coming out. What I wanted to say with this slide here is really that changes are going to happen also in the next 20 years, and a lot of things are going to happen. I recently picked up a book by Schmidt, the Google chairman, who together with one of his colleagues have been writing about the impact of new technologies in the way we operate. in the way we are interconnected in this world, and in the way that we do businesses. It's completely going to change the next 5, 10, 15 years, including the fisheries and aquaculture sector. Why should the Nordics be innovative without having the Asians sitting behind taking it via the internet, via a smartphone, via whatever model? This will be completely a new way of thinking and being connected with each other, and therefore this is something to keep in mind. Now, what is green growth? For us at the OECD, it's looking at the types of capital we have to deal with here. We have the natural capital, the fish stocks as you wish. We have human people working in it, physical and intangibles capital. There's an important thing to be looking at in terms of the capital we can take from the fish stocks. We need to preserve them at the same time. And then we have the fundamental issue in capture fisheries, and that is that we need public intervention. This can be extended into the aquaculture sector because of the important links between aquaculture and capture fisheries, in particular in this region because of carnivorous fish species, but not only, also in aquaculture, public intervention is needed because of externalities that I'll come back to, and we have a role of innovation. What will it do? What will green growth do, and why is it important to look at green growth? Many people ask, what is the difference between green growth and sustainable development? And probably there's not that much of a difference. What there is for policymakers is that it's 10 times easier to sell green growth than to sell sustainable development. Sustainable development is like marmalade. There's all sorts of things in it. Nobody can tell the difference. Green growth is much easier. It provides policy actions, provides a platform to deliver something. We want green and we want growth, and that's the whole idea in it. So increase also all of the profitability of the sector that provides for the growth. We may get additional fish, that is particularly in the case in aquaculture, and we will make the capture fisheries sector much more competitive. The question to the previous speaker actually alludes to this, and what you did ask for, I think, was what happens with increased aquaculture production for capture fisheries, and I can tell you it's going to be undermined. Not in the Nordic region because you've made the reforms necessary. You have placed fisheries on a market-based system, but there will be a lot of countries, in particular in Southern Europe, where they have not introduced these type of reforms, and where aquaculture ultimately will reduce incomes for fishermen, will make them less competitive, and create possibly a given havoc at a given point in time. So that's one of the more reasons, additional reasons why going on a green growth reform path is so abundantly important in the case of fisheries. The increasing competition from aquaculture is something that we really need to take much more serious today than what we have been doing so far. This leads me to this point here, and that is that fisheries and aquaculture are fundamentally completely two different production systems. You probably already know this, but what is really important is that the fisheries is using a public asset. It's a common property, most often held in common property, whereas the aquaculture system is in private. It's private property, private operators, and they almost can do whatever they want to do within some given constraints of a regulatory system. What can we do? What can the Nordic marine sector do to maintain its competitive advantage? And I come back to, again, this question about what happens between the two sectors and what is therefore needed for public policymakers to be looking at. Well, first of all, we like to be thinking in the OECD terms to pricing pollution and natural resource use much better than what we're doing today. Natural resource use does not simply have a price, and that's a problem in many parts of the world. In the Nordics, it's a bit better, and again, thank you for those reforms that have taken place in both Denmark and in Faroe Islands, in Iceland and in Norway, are the best cases and best examples of what has been going on. We also suggest that perverse subsidies is something that needs to get rid of. We have subsidies that goes into energy use, fuel subsidies and what have you. We don't see the need for these type of things. And ultimately it's also leading to higher levels of use of energy, which is an unnecessary thing. And once you have put the sectors on a more sustainable footing and more economically viable footing, then these subsidies are of absolutely no need. Aquaculture, we have some interesting examples coming out of Denmark these days, where the regulatory standards looks at outcomes more than inputs. So loading of pollution into the environment, how much are you allowed to put CO2s and NOxes and SOxes and what have you, is something to be looked at in terms of outcomes. Look at inertia through innovation and infrastructure investment. This is one of the reasons why we're meeting here. One of the reasons why the Nordic Council has this innovation program is to exactly see what are the possibilities for coming together and highlighting the areas where innovation are possible, and including on the infrastructure investments. Previous speaker has mentioned the issue of governance. I think it's a fundamental one. Governance needs to be having a far better capacity to deliver sustainable outcomes or green growth outcomes, including that the institutional capacity may in some cases not be sufficient. This again is not particular in the Nordic region, but I gather that in the Pacific Asian region, when we look at aquaculture, is really a serious issue there that needs to be addressed. And then finally also augment the innovation demand. What does that imply? Well, that implies that you have regulatory environments that are stable, that are predictable, and that are there, and that are known. If you can do that, you're going to be better at getting the take-up of innovations. Recently, we have in OECD produced this particular study. I encourage you to look at our website and take a look at this particular study, which is quite an interesting way of looking at ways forward for how innovation actually can be fostered through this green growth prism that is so central to the way that we wish to see policymakers deliver economic growth. Coming back to the issue, I just wanted to signal again, clear and stable market signals. Predictability is absolutely fundamental for any private enterprise that wants to go into innovation. There is an interesting discussion, and this is perhaps an area where we are a little bit more open in OECD to subsidies and what have you, basic and long-term research, which does have a public element to it, are public goods, and therefore can be financed by the public coffers. But at the same time, you also recognize that there are private benefits coming out of this research, and the extent to which that you have these private benefits coming out, companies becomes more profitable, innovators becomes rich because of various ways of dealing with innovations and so on and so forth. These type of economies needs in some way to be finding its way back into who paid for them, for these innovations. Take up again, strengthen the markets for green innovation. And then one thing that we perhaps have not been thinking too much about is consumer behavior. One of the areas that we are dealing with just now in the case of fisheries and aquaculture is waste. And we know, for example, that in the area of waste of fisheries, 30 to 40% of all fish is being wasted at the end where the consumer sits. And this is something that needs to be reduced, and education is part of that. And there, the public has a particular important role to play in ensuring that consumers, they actually understand what they're doing, understand how to use the fish, understand that even if you have an end-of-use date, it might actually be that 1 day more, 2 days more is fully acceptable. And there are other areas of where one needs to be helping the consumers to make informed decisions about what to eat, what not to eat. I promised you at the beginning that I wanted to go and broaden this a bit. And this is partly out of the concern that we are seeing in OECD, and that is that we have a terrible increase in the use of the oceans that have been taking place over the last couple of decades. I will show you a photo, not as nice photos as the previous speaker, but I have one photo with me to give you an idea about in one part of the world where things are happening at a fairly phenomenal rate, and that puts incredible pressure on the coastal zone and on the oceans more generally. We don't usually think about it. We know that the oceans is for food. Yeah. We also have medicines coming out of this area now. Some of the pharmaceuticals that are coming out of the oceans are of terrifically interesting things because they are a new genetics. They can do many things that we are not yet fully aware of, and we know that they are there, and this is an area where there will be a tremendous amount of innovation focus going on over the next couple of decades. Energy use is becoming a serious problem for everybody. Energy costs money. Fossil fuels cost a terrible amount of money, and therefore we are trying to use oceans for energy use, either by putting up windmills or by using tidal waves, or in other ways tilling the oceans for its energy and tap the energy for use on terrestrial activities. We have transport activities going on. We have mineral oil and gas extraction. We don't need to go into that. We have an incredible increase in the amount of tourism that takes place in the coastal zone, in the coastal area, and in the oceans. Just look out here at the Harpa here. I came in yesterday by the number 1 from the airport, and you see humongous big vessels with, God knows, 5,000 tourists on them that cruises up in the North Atlantic and have fun. And this is just one. Well, you can go to Copenhagen and you'll see 5 of them. You can go to the Mediterranean and you'll see 50 of them. And all this has been increasing tremendously over the last couple of decades and is likely to increase even more so. We have a terrific issue, perhaps not in Iceland, but in other parts of the world, with dumping. This is not only a question about urban and the city of Reykjavik dumps something into the oceans here, but we have agriculture runoffs, we have industrial runoffs, all uses of the oceans that are creating havoc for fisheries and aquaculture in some places. We have habitat coastal development. On a later slide, you will know that 44% of the world's population, they live within 150 kilometers of the coastline. In the United States, it's 60% of the population that lives within 50 kilometers of the coastline. Well, you can imagine that in the middle of the United States, there's no one. And finally, there is a cultural importance, also something that we don't regularly think about, but the oceans have a cultural importance. Iceland made a very good point to underline this, because you were populated, I think, by Vikings that came up here, again, using the oceans as the way to get here. And this is part of the culture, is that you have this link with the oceans. As I mentioned, we have a lot of populations living there. We have, an increasing and accelerating amount of people that wants to live here because it's nice. The coastal area is seen by most people as a prime area. We have crowding. We have the fact that the lagoons and coastal waters are reclaimed, wetlands are drained. Last week I was in Bahrain. Bahrain is a tiny little island, half island I think, sitting just outside Saudi Arabia. The island is like 70 kilometers long and 40 kilometers wide. They have a serious problem of building buildings, and these buildings, they are like 50, 60, 70 stories high. They reclaim oceans for that purpose. So they just simply take out oceans, put in dumping some material there, and then they build buildings on it. Amazingly, it has impacts on one of the core industries in Bahrain, which is pearls. Not culture of pearls, but natural pearls. The quality of natural pearls from Bahrain has decreased the last 15 years because of land reclamation. And again, this is one of the consequences of the way we use the oceans. Sewage waste, we discussed this. At the same time, we have to recognize that the coastal area, they are really productive, not only for fish and fish products, but they are genetically extremely varied and therefore important to keep. The oceans are an important part of the ecosystems. Climate change, it is a regulator of the climate change system, and therefore the way that we deal with the oceans may have impacts on the way climate change actually happens. We know that issues of the Gulf Stream, for example, have been noted to change because of the way that heat is stored within that particular chain and the system. And there's one last thing, and again, the previous speaker was very keen on underlying this, that in many communities in this world here, in particular in the Asian Pacific region, also in Africa, the oceans is really the only means of living. It is a subsistence living. If you don't have anything to eat, you just take your rod or you take your boat and you go out and catch a fish. And this is the way you survive. And this is a particularly important thing for around 1 billion people a year, I think, that have a complete living in the FAO may be able to have that figure. But it's quite a few people whose subsistence is considered to be like that. I promised you a photo. This is from South Korea. Here you have a few aquaculture installations. The white ones, which are further out, they are seaweeds, and the closer ones here are mussels and oysters. And just behind the next islands you have there, you have a chemical plant. You can't see it because it's hidden, but you have a chemical plant which supplies the southern part of South Korea with petrol. You have golf courses, you have tourism activities, and all sorts of other things happening here. And I'll tell you, it's not beautiful. And that's really something that we increasingly see in certain parts of this world, not in Iceland, it may be too cold yet. But you know, with climate change, this might actually also be a feasible way forward for here. What this suggests for us, and again we come back to this green growth model, and where does that lead us to think in terms of both fisheries and aquaculture? Well, it leads us to think bigger. It leads us to think that fisheries and aquaculture sits in a system that goes beyond fisheries and aquaculture and looks into the fact that we are competing for resources, we are competing for the use of the oceans with other user groups. We were mentioning all these before, chemicals and energy use and what have you, and transport and so on and so forth. But it's really important to see that in that context. And one of the things that we need to be doing is to move more towards integrated oceans management models. And in this context here, better understand the activities, the value of the activities that takes place in the oceans. It is one of the projects that we are undertaking now within the OECD, not in my division, but in another part of the organization where this is being considered to be a particular interesting issue to look at. To look much more into the impacts of these different activities that takes place. To look into new models for how to operate all these different user groups and get them organized in a way so that the incentive structures become rights among the different groups of users. One of the key problems that we face, and luckily we have something like OECD where we tend to operate and cooperate across various sectors. So when we look at oceans, I work together with people from our tourism area, from our energy area, and so on and so forth, and biotechnology area, and what have you. But it's extremely difficult at the national level. And one of the things that we are extremely concerned about is that when we talk to fisheries people, you just don't even want to talk with the environment people. And just even thinking about talking with energy people, oh, forget it, you know. It's timely, it costs money and whatever have you. But this is something that is needed. And it's something that we need to be thinking about over the next couple of decades, simply as the pressure on these oceans resources becomes increasingly a matter of concern for all of us. So therefore, we need to look at our institutions. Are they adapted to take this into consideration and to actually deliver on a more global green growth model? Finally, monitoring progress. There is a need for appropriate what we call green growth indicators, a way to look at how we actually can see that we are moving in the right direction. Within all this, and this is going to be my last word on it, within all this there is an incredible role for innovation. The 14 projects I think that the Nordic Innovation Project has so far come up with are really an important part of the new world, of the new ways of thinking, of the new ways of communicating, and of this interconnected world where we are all going in the next 10, 15, 20 years to be working out of one computer, being connected with all of us 24 hours a day and with 7 to 9 billion people. And this is an incredible opportunity. And rather than being pessimistic, I think somewhat at the end of your previous speaker's speech, I think that this is an opportunity. This is an incredible opportunity to innovate and to be thinking about that your innovations might actually be helpful in the Asia-Pacific region, and vice versa, what they're doing in the Asia-Pacific region in terms of aquaculture can be also particularly helpful here, within limits. We understand that there are issues of aquaculture runoffs and pollution and chemicals and stuff like that that you do not want to import into the Nordic region, I suggest. But there will be other things that may be particularly useful and carrying forward to helping on the innovative aspects of the Nordic area. One final point. In aquaculture, what I have remarked over the last several decades is that because aquaculture has been subject to regulatory environments, in particular in Denmark, but not only. I may also be up in Iceland here and in Sweden. Norway is a bit more open to it. But the regulatory environments have been very, very strict. And in Denmark, for example, we had a moratorium on the introduction of new marine aquaculture systems. I think it was put into place in 1995, but it was only lifted a couple of years ago. Within that space, Denmark became a prime innovator of land-based aquaculture systems. And again, it just shows you that subject to whatever regulatory environment you are working under, innovations can actually flourish, can become a prime producer of systems, of ways of thinking, of new models, of new modes of operation. And this is exactly the fundamental issue in innovation. Innovation goes beyond the question of a hardware. It is not just the question about being able to produce a given piece of a can or a given piece of a net to be in a marine cage or whatever have you. It's also models of working. It's what I would call soft technology. It's also the way that the public actually delivers. So it's also the regulatory environment, which is also subject to some types of innovation, including in particular, if you look at the capture fisheries, then the move towards market-based economic instruments, like, for example, they've done now in Denmark recently. Or it can be the way that the public starts using its own resources to deliver better outcomes, regulatory outcomes. I'm reminded about, for example, the recent innovation, maybe we call it like that, where in Denmark they started using CCTVs on board vessels with a view to look after and survey what vessels actually were doing and combine that particular effort and those type of CCTV recordings with data captured from logbooks, from electronic logbooks. And those are maybe simple things, but this is part of this whole innovation package that we need to be thinking about and need to be much more open about in the future. As long as it's within a concept of green growth, so delivering on more growth, but also with due regard to the environmental externalities, then we would be much better off in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl Christian Schmidt. We have time for one or two questions.
My name is Gisli Gislason. I work for Marine Stewardship Council in Iceland. There's a question to the organization. Will these conference slides be available on the webpage afterwards, so it will be accessible?
Yeah, the slide, everything will be available, even recording from the session.
More questions or comments? Grímur again.
Again, making use of the microphone, and sorry for not introducing myself. My name is Grímur Valdimarsson. I work I'm a senior advisor at the Ministry of Industries and Innovation. I have a question and a comment for Carl Christian. I worked with him for a number of years on many things, and the OECD is a very progressive organization thinking about the global situation. And my question is, when he was describing the sort of ocean governance, how, and also Dr. Eknath in aquaculture, that the governance is becoming more and more complex. We have aquaculture, we have capture fisheries, we have oil exploration, even Iceland is now entering that. We have tourism, we have mining in the seabed and so on. So my question to Carl Christian and some comments. You know, the World Ocean Council is trying to address this, that we have common governance of fisheries, aquaculture, oil, shipping, and what have you. What do you think? Are they getting anywhere? And my second question is, has the OECD had any thoughts about sort of a new governance system? We know that, for example, in fisheries, there are so many international organizations dealing with fisheries. We can name the FAO, we have UNIDO even doing industry work, we have UNEP, we have the General Assembly doing quite a bit. So are there any new ideas on how we can manage this whole thing and avoid the environmental mess that we are fighting off basically every day? And as Dr. Eknath so well described. Any comments on this?
Well, thank you, Gregor. On the first point, I think it is well taken that the World Oceans Council, and it's not the only operator within the oceans, there's an enormous amount of activities that goes on at the moment on oceans. It's like over the last 5 years, oceans have become sexy. And therefore, of course, OECD also needs to do something about this. And I think I would like to capture it a little bit like that at the moment, because it has become sexy. The problem is that we don't know anything about it. And this is where OECD comes in. And this is the reason why in one of my slides I was telling you about the need to understand the value of the activities. Nobody even has figures on this stuff. So how can you imagine that the World Ocean Council, for that matter, or anybody else, can start coming up with sensible ways of looking at it without figures? Our approach to it has been one of gradual and start in the slow motion and start at the bottom of this pile of problems that we face. And I agree with you, it's very complex. It becomes far more and more complex when you move into global oceans management or blue economy management or what have you. We need simply to start from one place, and that is, what is the value, what's the number, what's the figures we can put on it. There are a couple of countries that know something about it. France is one of them, Korea, Australia. There's a little bit in the United States, and then I think it starts thinning out quite considerably. But before we have those figures on the table, an organization like the OECD, looking at it from an economic perspective, would have very big difficulties in moving forward on it. And I think that therefore we are starting very slowly, but I think it's an important contribution to the whole debate that we at least start thinking about these things. So that's one issue. The other issue is that, and this comes back to a more national regulatory inertia that exists, administrative inertia. Managing oceans, if that is the ultimate goal, is not permeating into national administrations yet. And it doesn't permeate international administrations for the other reason that I was mentioning in one of my slides, and that is that there's a complete lack of coherence across the institutional setup at the national level. When, again, I come back to my previous experience in working in the Ministry of Fisheries in Copenhagen, when we discussed working together with the Ministry of Environment, or just even having a dialogue with them, I was just told, no, just forget it. I mean, we don't like these guys. And it's the same thing as vice versa. Now, hopefully, 30 years on, it's becoming much better, but there's still an enormous amount of inertia and difficulties in working across governments. And that coherence is lacking, and we urge everybody to be looking much more seriously into that coherence. The way that we take on the fisheries sector at the moment is through this green growth prism. Green growth is I believe we are only at the starting stage of this green growth work, but the green growth prism is a tremendous opportunity for policymakers to identify why there is a need for reform. And again, Iceland, Denmark, Norway, they've already done it. We're not talking about these countries. We're talking about countries like France, Spain, to be closer to where we are here, where the possibilities for doing reform are stymied by the fact that there is no common understanding of the necessity to go on a green growth path. So there is a whole working that is needed, working with the governments, working with the institutions, working with stakeholders that needs to take place. But I do believe that the green growth prism and model offers some fundamental new ways in the next 5 to 10 years to move forward on a serious fisheries policy reform that finally will put sustainability at the focus of the national fisheries management systems. Thank you.